Durante, and he said, "Aren't you shocked by this?" And he says, "Oh, well, you have to break some eggs to make an omelet. We're building a new society." Well, this is their idea. This is their same viewpoint. Is that, oh yes, we may harm a lot of people, we may kill some babies, we may create some new diseases, we may wipe out whole populations at a time, but that's the price we have to pay to create the new vision, the new society. And these people admitted in many of their writings, if you take the time to read these things. For instance, one of the great ophthalmologist, I've forgotten his name now, I think it was Wise, but he was an ophthalmologist back in the 1950s. And one of the greatest. They still give an award in his name. And he wanted to euthanize anybody who was blind. It always starts with the worst case scenario. And he said, well, it's terrible that people are born blind. Therefore, what we'll do is we'll sterilize all families that had blind children so they can't have any more blind children. Well, then other ophthalmologists came forward and said, well, 99% of blindness has nothing to do with heredity. He was going to sterilize all blind people, so none of them could have children. Well, then he carried it even further. He said, well, anyone with impaired vision should be sterilized. And then it became anyone who wears glasses should be sterilized. So we always see this progression. It starts out with a worst case scenario to sell it to the public, because the public feelings of sympathy and empathy are easily engendered when you pull this little child that has this horrible disease. You say, we need to do this so that this doesn't ever happen. And then you approve that, and then the next thing you know, we're killing people who just have minor problems. I call it the Kevorkian progression. If you remember Kevorkian in the beginning, it's people who have terminal diseases. They're going to die soon. Why let them suffer? Well, most people said, well, that makes sense. I don't think people should suffer. Then, they're not going to die anytime soon, but they have a disease that's crippling, and it's not nice to have to live like that, so he killed them. Well, then people started saying, well, I don't know if I agree with that. They can live with that condition. They just not be able to do everything they'd like to. Well, where did it end up? Then he was killing a woman because she was depressed. So there's always this progression. It starts out with a worst case scenario to sell it because of its power of empathy. And then once it's sold and becomes legislation and a law, then we start including large numbers of people who are nowhere near that severe. Well, this is what happened in eugenics. In eugenics, they were going to round up anyone who didn't have full capability to have a Harvard education. They wanted to build compounds to put them in. If you had just moderately low IQ, they wanted to forcibly sterilize, and they did. They forcibly sterilized some 36,000 people in America before it was finally ended. And as I said, the major proponents of this eugenics idea back in the 1920s and early 30s were traveling to Germany, meeting with eugenicists over there, telling them about what we were doing in America in the early ages, in the 1910s and 1920s. And this is where Hitler created his eugenics program. Hitler was, exchanging eugenicist ideas with people from the Rockefeller Foundation. Stoddard was one of these people. He wrote a book about it, in which he was exchanging these eugenics ideas from the Rockefeller Foundation with Hitler. And Hitler built this huge program of forced sterilization of people he felt like shouldn't reproduce. That's what stopped the eugenics movement in America, and the Rockefeller people, according to Dr. Lilly, and she had access to the Rockefeller records by permission of the family. According to that, he ended that program and told them, don't use the name eugenics anymore. We're going to use the name social engineering so that people won't know what we're doing, that we're continuing this program under a different name. But it all started out in 1910 with the idea of science of man, of recreating man. Scientific discovery took place as we learned more about cells, we learned about DNA, we learned about inheritance patterns, how genes worked, how you could turn them on and off. As our pharmacology became more sophisticated, all of this increase our ability technologically to carry out some of these things. Now you have to realize most of molecular biology is beneficial. I'm not opposed to molecular biology. The vast majority of it is extremely beneficial. But that gives you a huge cover because you can't attack molecular biology. So, well, what about the things we learned to stop diabetes? What about the things we're doing now with heart disease and cancer? It all came because of molecular biology. Well, I admit that, and I'm for that. I think we should continue molecular biology. What we should divorce from it is an elitist idea that government, in conjunction and using this technological ability, can force behavioral changes in people against their will. To use this technology to change your ability to have independent thought. There's a neuroscientist by the name of Delgado, who was one of the leading experts in the world of deep brain stimulation. He suddenly disappeared from the scene, stopped publishing papers, stopped writing books, didn't attend conferences any longer. And I think it was Discover magazine traced him down and found him and asked him, what are you doing now? And he said, well, I work for the federal government on a secret project. And he said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I can't tell you a lot of details, but I don't have to use electrodes anymore to change human thought. I can do it at a distance with my directed microwave. And I can aim it at certain parts of your brain and fill you with fear or make you hear voices or see things. And he said, that's all I can tell you, but I get unlimited money, the best laboratory in the world, and all I want to do this research. Well, he wrote a book before he did this, Physical Control of the Mind. And in that book, he says the last refuge of the individual is their own thought. And that is the target of certain people in the world, is to remove your ability to think on your own. They made it where the people that they wanted to control understood this money comes to you as long as your project goes in the direction we want it to. The money will stop flowing if you stop doing it. So there's this understanding of our goal, where we want to go with this, and that if you want the money and you want this multi-million-dollar laboratory, we have this unwritten understanding, and I don't even have to tell you, you just kind of know that's what I want. About the regulatory agencies, the EPA, FDA, all of these regulatory agencies, alphabet agencies, they were all established sort of the same methodology, that this is to protect the public. And they gave justification, contamination of the foods if we don't regulate it, contamination of this, of the drugs if we don't regulate it, which gave good justification for some regulation of different things to protect the public, which most people agreed with. The problem is that over time, the people with the most power and influence were able to influence the regulatory agencies, so they were not looking after the public, they were looking after the person supplying the most money. And usually it is the very agencies that they're regulating. For instance, the Food and Drug Administration, what we've had, and there's been a number of books written on it, a number of exposés on it, is that individuals of the FDA will be receiving either promised jobs when they retire that are very lucrative if they'll just pass this drug and give it the okay. This has gotten so bad now, we have just numerous drugs have entered the market and harmed and killed tens of thousands of people, which when the investigation looks at it, they found out, in fact, they knew this drug was harmful before it was ever approved. The early studies, some of them had been faked by either the companies being investigated and the FDA was aware of it, or the early studies did indicate that these dangers were there. They approved it anyway, and then once it entered into the marketplace, thousands of people were harmed. You may remember some of the anti-inflammatory COX-2 drugs. One of them came out on the market, and it's estimated as many as 80,000 people died of a complication that was known before the drug was ever approved, and it was known by the FDA regulatory agencies. So we have a number of cases in which the regulatory agencies were being heavily influenced by the people they were regulating. This is true with the Superfund. There's a number of studies looking at EPA and Superfund in which the people doing the polluting, they're not corrected, they just pass over it. And I've looked into some of this myself with some of the regulatory agencies, for instance, vaccine contamination. I looked up some of the FDA records on the investigation of the people that were supplying components of the vaccine that were heavily contaminated, either with hepatitis virus or at risk of the mad cow prion contaminants. And what the FDA would do would go into the company, identify the danger that they were collecting specimens that were contaminated or high risk of contamination, and then they would just write up a report and never come back and see if they had corrected it. So they're allowed to continue the practice without any fine, without any follow-up to see if this had been stopped. So this is one of the other reasons I worry a lot about vaccines, because there's indications that they're highly contaminated. They're using contaminated serum to make it by getting this from small labs all over the world in the United States. And there's been numerous cases in which, for instance, a vaccine in the UK, they found out that one of the people that they were getting the serum from died of mad cow disease. And their response was, well, we don't think it's going to cause any problem, but tens of thousands of people had received that vaccine contaminated with the mad cow. So, you know, what we call this is the revolving door. One of the best demonstrated examples, and you can find this on Betty Martini's site, Mission Possible. If you go to that site, you'll find the full document reproduced. And so when they were doing the first approval of aspartame, when it was made by G.D. Searle Company, they told G.D. Searle, do some experiments and present them to the FDA, and we'll see about approval. Well, they did the experiments and studies on mice, and they presented to G.D. Searle, and a board of scientists, which included neuroscientists, said, well, we don't think this should be approved because there's a very high incidence of brain tumors in animals exposed to aspartame, and other tumors as well, and some other problems. Well, the chairman of that scientific committee overrode their decision and approved it anyway, and then shortly after that, I think within 3 to 6 months, he went to work for the PR agency for G.D. Searle. So this was sort of the revolving door and how aspartame ever got approved in the first place. Now, a government regulatory committee was asked to look at this and see if indeed there were an increased number of brain tumors. And so they went back and got all the G.D. Searle slides, all the material that was used for these studies, and they found out that many of the slides had been destroyed that had tumors in them. They found out that the people that were doing the examination of the slides were not qualified, that the studies on the effect of aspartame on developing babies was done by a person who had no experience whatsoever in examining the embryologic effects of this toxin, and that there was evidence of numerous types of tumors being induced